make a video talking about labels and ideology. And I was going to talk about the few labels that I would claim and the others that I would reject, and give the reasons for my thoughts on this. Ultimately, I view ideology simply as a tool. It is a tool for achievement and ascension. It is a tool for surviving and then thriving. That's pretty much my view on it. But of course, your ideology, and you know, I don't confine myself necessarily to a lot of these labels that I see people in these circles, you know, prescribing for various figures and talking heads. I don't really confine myself to just one, but I'll get into that later whenever I decide to make that video. But there is one, you know, your ideology, whatever it may be, should be influenced by your own life experience, your own real world experience, not just these lofty notions and ideals that you have read about in a book from, say, a century or 2 centuries ago. Because ideology should be pragmatic, it should be utilitarian, it should have a use. And I suppose you could say my own worldview has been influenced tremendously by my own life experience. It's not so much books. And one of the labels that I'll briefly touch on in this future video is that I would claim is ruralism, localism, and regionalism. Now there's going to be a lot of ists and isms in this video. Well, not this one, but the future one. I believe living rurally is much more conducive to our native European biospirit, and it's how I was raised, in extreme rural northeast Tennessee up on a mountain. But I don't denigrate in the least those of us that live in an urban environment, because one thing I've realized over the last few years is the people that live in cities, and they have to contend with a lot of the wildlife and the other races. They have a leg up on those who have grew up in, say, lily white suburbia, or you know, even rural Appalachia, where the population is 95% white, sometimes even higher. They have a leg up because they know how to deal with these other races, and and that's something, whether you like it or not, we're going to have to fucking deal with in the future. Even in rural America, you know, they're busting all these invaders to your areas. You know, that's why I like listening to the stories that Thomas 777. Oh shit, this ain't gonna work, but I'm gonna try to get it out anyway. That's why I like listening to Thomas's stories. That's why I like listening to John Fashcroft and my friend Patrick. That's why I like listening to these guys, because they have experience, much more experience than I do in dealing with the other races. Although since moving to southeast Tennessee, I have had to deal with them more, because there's more of them down here. But what I've got for you in this video, I'm going to read a chapter from a book that was, I believe, published in 1961. It's called Night Comes to the Cumberlands. It was written by Henry Caudill. who was raised in eastern Kentucky, and so far I have to say I'm very impressed with this book. I'm very impressed with this book so far. I'm going to read a chapter about the blood feuds that came at the end of the War of Northern Aggression, the American Civil War. Now, this book is maligned by some people. Caudill, he doesn't really pull any punches, and he addresses a lot of the problems that plagues Appalachia. And you know, regionalism, localism, I'm concerned about Appalachia. It's my home. I've lived here my entire life, and I don't plan on going anywhere else. Not saying that I appreciate the culture, the regional differences in this country among our people and across the world, absolutely. But I believe to have the greatest effect, you need to be in the area in which you want to exert that effect. And what was I going to say? That's why I would consider myself into localism. But I'm going to read this chapter because I think it's extremely interesting. And Caudill, like I said, he didn't pull any punches, and he wanted to discuss the problems that was plaguing Appalachia. I think this book became so popular because JFK, back in the, I believe it was in the late 50s, maybe 1960, it was either maybe in the first year of his presidency, or it might have been when he was considering running for president. He took a trip to West Virginia, coal mining country, southern West Virginia, and he was absolutely astounded at the poverty that he witnessed there. And in this book, like, I'm only right now about 80 pages through this book, and I've not finished it yet, of course. I found it on archive.org, and it is, I think it's about 400 pages long altogether. But it's a book that I can, I just dive into because I find it well written, extremely interesting. But man, some of the things that Caudill talks about among the heritage Appalachian, God, it describes me and my worldview quite well. But anyways, I'm going to head back here to the house, and I'm going to read you this chapter here shortly. Watch out, Bo. Let me sit down. You're damn lucky. There you go. These dogs, let me tell you, these hounds are something else. I wanted to sit out here in the sunlight and further elaborate on some of the stuff I talked about earlier. Watch out, Bobo. And try to clarify a few things about why I'm going to read this tale of these blood feuds to you. I've toyed around with this idea of starting maybe my own sort of, I don't know if I'd call it a philosophy or ideology. I mentioned it first in this video called Front Porch Esotericism that I made last summer. I want to start something called Appalachianism. And it's going to be a reflection in a way of the heritage Appalachians' biospirit. I want it to reflect the spirit of the Border English, the Ulster Scots, and the Germans who settled this area centuries ago. And I want it to have utility. And those utilities are like I said, a reflection of the biospirit. People in Appalachia are extremely clannish, much like their Ulster Scot forebears were. And we also see this in various regions of Europe amongst the various ethnicities. Clannish and tribalism, the extended family, clannishness, tribalism, is very prominent in the Ulster Scots, the Irish, the Norse, during and prior to the Viking Age, also displayed this characteristic. And even the Italians, with their infamous blood feuds, say in Sicily. You know, the extended family was extremely important to a lot of these ethnicities. I think we need to bring that back. It's not just about the nuclear family. Of course, you want to keep that intact, but I would go so far as to try to keep the extended family intact, because we're going to need that here in the future. The other one, another tenet of this sort of Appalachianism, and I've not thought all this all the way through yet. These are just some ideas I'm putting out there. Another one is militancy, retaliation, and retribution. You know, I think we're going to be embarking on some violent times potentially. You know, I get so tired of seeing videos posted by large social media accounts that shows white kids just getting the piss beat out of them, or white men, whoever, you know, or just them being so docile and submissive when confronted by one of these so-called minorities. I get tired of seeing that shit. I call it, you know, ball-up nationalism. That's what I call it when I see these large social media accounts post this shit. I mean, they say, oh, but you gotta wake up the normies. Maybe, you know. But I mean, really, if you've been around this more than like a couple of months, you should have a thorough fucking understanding of what is going on. I don't need to see that shit. I don't need to see this rage porn every fucking day. I fucking get it. I done know. So you need to get rid of that, you know. I mean, really, I would rather see otherwise. I want to see white people sticking up for themselves and being militant and aggressive. Because hard times are coming. And I get tired, and you know what that does to you psychologically? When you just sit around and watch that shit all the time, you know, it makes you think, you know, that you are absolutely defenseless. Oh, look how violent these other types are. Fuck that. Fuck that shit. You know why? Nobody does fucking violence better than we do. I mean, look at the history. And retribution. I mean, all through our history as Europeans, native Europeans. I mean, you look at the Iliad. That is an epic story of retribution, just back and forth, back and forth. Paris steals Helen, starts a Mediterranean war. And then you have Hector killing Patroclus, Achilles killing Hector, Paris eventually killing Hector, or Achilles, I should say. Just back and forth. Retribution and retaliation is in our blood. This docile bullshit that has been, you know, held to us as some sort of virtue for the last century or so ain't gonna cut it here in the fucking future. The last tenet is lawlessness. Appalachians tend to be an uncouth and lawless people. And I myself in my own life have dealt with this. I have experienced it. I mean, I used to be a criminal, to be honest. I was a drug addict and a criminal. I don't like the police. I'm not one of these back the blue people. I'm not going to castigate all individual cops, because I do know of a couple of cops they're good people. They're just doing a job. But the institution itself, I absolutely hate the police. Because they are the front line of the system that we hate. They're the front line. I don't know. I certainly wouldn't be a cop. It's not in my blood. Nobody in my family has ever worked for law enforcement. In fact, we've often found ourselves on the other side of that fence. But a sort of lawlessness. Now, I'm not encouraging people, and I said retribution. I'm not encouraging violence. I can't. I mean, I don't know who watches these videos. You got to be careful what you fucking say. I'm not encouraging violence or lawlessness, but one thing that as you navigate this so-called, whatever we call it, white nationalism, your online persona, you need to learn how to navigate like a criminal. And it's hard for me to really describe what I mean by this right now. One of my favorite things to study is the various criminal syndicates in this country's history and elsewhere, because you can learn a lot from them. Now, from my own life experience, I have had experience with this, but I'm not encouraging a life of crime, of course, but you can learn from these various groups, like these motorcycle gangs, like Hell's Angels, the Italian Mafia. I know a lot of people will say it's, the Jewish Mafia, which, of course, there was Bugsy Siegel, Mo Dalitz, all these, Jewish people that were involved. But originally it started out as a Sicilian thing, and that's who done it the best, I believe. That's one thing I've learned about the tribe over the years, is I don't think they really have much of anything that's original. They just actually excel at co-opting things for their own nefarious means. So you need to learn how to navigate like a criminal. And I mean, I've said this before in previous videos. The future, if you're pro-white, as it currently stands right now, you're going to be viewed as a criminal. I'm serious. Even if you are an upstanding citizen, if you have these views and you love your own and want the best for your own, you will be viewed as a potential criminal. Now, the Overton window might shift, the paradigm might shift, but at its current trajectory, this is what I see happening. Is there anything else about Appalachianism? There's a lot more that I need to think and ponder and talk to some of my friends about these ideas. But I do think, the clannishness and a sort of militancy. As I said, not encouraging violence, but you need to put up a fearsome front and be capable. Because that's what these other races do. They think you're an easy mark. I get so sick of that. Seeing whites getting, taken advantage of, abused. All because they're too timid and too shy and too worried about labels that could be thrown their way for handling and standing on their own business, for taking care of things. My thoughts on that is retribution, an eye for an eye. But anyways, let me read this chapter to you. First off, I want to read you something before we get into the chapter. There was an Austrian author. His name was Karl Anton Postel. He went by the pseudonym Charles Sealsfield, and he traveled across America back in the early 1800s. And he cataloged his travels in a work called The Americas as They Are. And he wrote an entire section on the Kentucky mountaineers that he came into contact with. Now, I had to abbreviate this post in order to be able to fit it in on Telegram, and also I had to chop it up to post it on Twitter. But on Kentuckians, the mountaineers, this is Charles Sealsfield's own words. The inhabitants consist chiefly of immigrants from Virginia, North and South Carolina, and of descendants of backwoods settlers, a proud, fierce, and overbearing set of people. They established themselves in a continual state of warfare with the Indians, a cruel and an implacable spirit. This, indeed, is their principal feature. A Kentuckian will wait 3 or 4 weeks in the woods for the moment of satiating his revenge. He seldom or never forgives. The men are of an athletic form, and there may be found amongst them many models of truly masculine beauty. Passions must work with double power and effect. Where wealth and arbitrary sway over a herd of slaves and a warfare of 30 years with savages have sown the seeds of the most lawless arrogance and an untamable spirit of revenge. The literary institutions, the University of Kentucky at Lexington and the college at Bairdstown, have hitherto exercised no influence over these fierce people. I thought that was a very edifying and clarifying excerpt there. Now let's see. Water in here. I might have to stop and get some water in a minute. Let me pull up this chapter here. This is, well, let me read this one line, this one paragraph. This is after the Civil War. And Henry Caudill states here in Night Comes to the Cumberlands, "Thus the curtain rose upon one of the most fantastic dramas in American history, the ferocious Kentucky Mountain Feuds. Their story has gone largely unchronicled, but in savagery and stark horror they dwarf the cattle wars of the Great Plains, and by contrast make the vendettas of Sicily look like children's parlor games." And you know, these sort of blood feuds, every single area, little village in Appalachia, even my home village, there is stories of a blood feud between these two families. This blood feud probably went on from, say, the 30s up until, I believe, the late 70s, when they had to kind of unite against a common enemy. And this common enemy was the lawman. But anyways, this is, like I said, chapter 4 of Night Comes to the Cumberlands. It's titled The Wars. The Kentucky Mountain Feuds commenced a few years after the Civil War and continued with unchecked ferocity until about 1915. An interval of nearly half a century, these dreadful inter-family wars constitute a truly astounding chapter in American history. A few statistics from the region will reveal that the stark outline of their horror. During the half-century mentioned, the 19 counties of the plateau, the Cumberland Plateau up in eastern Kentucky, achieved a maximum average population of about 15,000 people. Careful research in the files of the circuit court clerk's office in one of the many counties disclosed that between 1865 and 1915, nearly 1,000 murder indictments were returned by the local grand juries. Thus, we know that 20 homicides per year occurred, and inevitably, many more killings must have taken place in which, for one reason or another, and no indictments were made. See, this is one thing. These people knew that you could make people disappear easily in these mountains and hollers. Appalachia is a land of secrets. Let me go get a glass of water before I continue. Alright, I'm back. Some of the feuds involved whole armies. A wandering Presbyterian preacher arrived in Hazard, the county seat of Perry County, to find the town in the midst of a roaring battle. This feud, then called the French Eversole War, eventually caused an almost complete suspension of the law courts within the county. The preacher arrived at a time when the two factions were locked in a mortal combat for the courthouse and its records. The Eversole clan had holed up in the structure, while the more numerous French faction fired at them from doors and windows of neighboring buildings. This siege lasted until the approach of a company of militiamen forced the besiegers to flee. Probably the most famous of the feuds was the Hatfield McCoy War. This great struggle eventually involved, directly or indirectly, practically every inhabitant of Pike County, Kentucky, and Logan County, West Virginia, and resulted in at least 65 deaths. This epic clan war was fought out to its grim conclusion with all the characteristic savagery and tenacity the borderers had displayed a century before in its struggle with the Indians. The vendetta brought the governments of these two states to the brink of war, and the correspondence between the governors on the matter reveals a situation so fantastic as to defy belief. During the war, according to a letter from West Virginia's Governor E.W. Wilson, the families fought on different sides and relations between them became unfriendly. In those days, before voter registration, the Hatfields habitually crossed the border to vote in Kentucky elections. This unlawful franchise was resented by the McCoys, and one of them, Tolbert by name, stabbed Big Ellison Hatfield to death at a voting precinct in 1882. Tolbert McCoy and his brothers Hermer and Randolph were arrested for the slaying, and law officers undertook to deliver them to the jailer at Pikeville. A dozen or more mounted men armed with Winchester rifles and Colt revolvers crossed the Tug River into Kentucky, and at gunpoint took the prisoners from the custody of the officers. They were taken out into the mountains, tied to pawpaw bushes, and shot. Their killers were led by Anderson Hatfield, a brother of Big Ellison. The McCoys retaliated with murderous raids into West Virginia after the killers and of their kinsmen, Jim Vance and William Dempsey, Hatfield warriors, were killed on one of these raids, and 6 captured Hatfields were carried back to Pikeville under guard. Eyewitnesses reported that 2 of the surviving McCoy brothers shook hands in self-congratulation over the dead bodies of their enemies and crowed like roosters, while their father, Randall McCoy, vowed he would not rest until he had slain Anderson Hatfield with his own hands and had cut a slice of meat from his body, broiled it, and ate it. Just goes to show the savage nature, I guess you could say. In due course, the Hatfields returned the raid. They surrounded Randall McCoy's cabin at night and set it afire. Another son, Calvin, was slain in the gunfire that followed. The vengeance seekers this time turned their guns on women and children when they fled the cabin. But old Randall escaped to continue the feud. 4 of his sons died in the long, vicious struggle. Both counties were occupied by militiamen time after time, and civil authorities were helpless and hopeless. Legend has it, however, that the feud at last ended happily in the marriage of 2 of the few survivors, a Hatfield youth to a McCoy girl. You know, this is historically one of the tactics that's used to bring these blood feuds to an end, is by intermarriage. Let's see. Knott County was riven by the terrible Knott County War, which raged for many years between the followers of Cap Hayes and Clabe Jones. Hayes had been a cavalry captain in the Confederate Army, and Jones a pro-Union guerrilla leader. When these 2 strong-willed men resumed the war in Knott County, most of the population enlisted in one faction or the other, and in a pitched battle at McPherson Post Office, which later became Hindman, the county seat, a half-dozen men were shot to death. Old Clabe Jones was renowned in a song as a booger, little less evil than the devil himself. When he was not feuding with the followers of Cap Hayes, he warred with Bad John Wright, his neighbor in Letcher County. This mountain baron was an ex-Confederate who was captured during the war and imprisoned in Ohio. He escaped and thereafter acquired a small fortune by repeatedly enlisting in the Union Army for the bounties which were paid. With his role of Yankee Greenbacks, he returned to his rebel unit, where he remained until the war ended. He and Hayes were eventually able to decimate the Jones crowd and bring this war at last to a close. One dreadful feud began when a family... One dreadful feud began when a family, which had given its support to the Union, buried the body of a little girl on land, which a family of ex-Confederates claimed as their own. The latter, the Confederates, unhesitatingly dug into the grave and pitched the coffined body across the fence onto the land recognized as belonging to the offenders. This hideous act elicited murderous retaliation and plunged the county into a war that lasted more than 2 decades and cost unnumbered lives. See, it's wild things go on in the mountains. In 1888, conditions became so tumultuous in feud-driven Rowan County that a special committee of the legislature was appointed to investigate the situation. It recommended that the act establishing the county be repealed, and that the territory be thenceforth governed by martial law. The committee found no disposition on the part of the officials to enforce the law or on the part of the populace to obey it. 20 open murders and secret assassinations had been committed in the county without a single conviction having been secured in the courts. In addition, 16 other persons had been wounded in shooting affrays. And this in a county shown by the census of 1890 to have a population of 6,129. But hardly a county was without its war, and some had a whole series. The troubles in Breathitt County won for that county the somber sobriquet of Bloody Breathitt, and gained for its populace the shocked attention of the world. An 80-year-old lawyer once related to me the unique manner in which court adjournments were occasionally obtained in its circuit court. A murder case was docketed for trial, and numerous friends of the defendant appeared at the courthouse heavily armed and in a belligerent mood. When the judge called the case for trial, the defendant's father, a man of about 50 with huge handlebar whiskers and 2 immense pistols, rose and walked to the judicial bench. Ringing the gavel from the fingers of the startled judge, the feudist rapped the bench and announced, "Court's over and everybody can go. We ain't a-going to have any court here this term, folks." The red-faced judge hastily acquiesced in this extraordinary order and promptly left town. When court convened at the next term, the court and sheriff were bolstered by 60 militiamen. But by then the defendant was not available for trial. He had been slain in an ambush. Nor was this incident the only one of its kind. Sometimes, though, the feudists were not satisfied with seeing a trial delayed or a judge run out of town. At least 4 men have been shot to death on the lawn or within the walls of the crumbling, ancient Breathitt County Courthouse at Jackson. And at Hillsville, Virginia, not far from the state line, feudists in the Allen Edwards Wars, enraged by the outcome of a trial, entered the circuit courtroom and shot to death the circuit judge, Commonwealth attorney, sheriff, and 3 of the jurors. Clay County was the scene of the White Baker War, a terrible and prolonged war of attrition in which countless participants died in grim gun battles, some of them on the streets of Manchester, the dusty little county seat. Immediately after the Civil War, a struggle for political power was waged within each county. Union and rebel forces fought for ascendancy by seeking to capture local offices. In no more than 4 counties were the discredited ex-Confederates able to succeed. Elsewhere, the good old Union boys elected their former comrades to fill the log courthouses and run the counties. These backwood politicians promptly set out to harass their old foes with indictments for wartime crimes. Long dockets accumulated in the circuit courts as Republican grand jurors charged defeated rebels with every imaginable crime. murder, arson, rape, grand and petty larceny, treason against the Commonwealth, unlawful assembly, conspiracy to commit unlawful acts, and obtaining property by false tokens. This last offense, the false tokens, referred to the purchases made with Confederate currency. So formidable were the assaults made on them through the courts that the unregenerate Confederates were in grave peril. Their reaction was deadly. Jurors quickly learned that to convict a man was to risk prompt and certain death. Not all rebels could be imprisoned, and once court was over and the juror was at home, his back became a target for rifles hidden on the hillside that overlooked his cabin. Even rabid, vengeance-thirsty Yankees became slow to convict. The courtroom perpetuation of war and feud, though it imprisoned few people, added fuel to the fires of hatred and kindled new violence on every hand. Nor did conviction by a court and jury mean the sentences would be carried out. When officers attempted to convey prisoners to the state penitentiary up in Frankfort, they had to traverse the baronies and many heavily armed feudal lords. Often, indeed, these mountain chiefs took pity on the prisoners, and supported by small armies of retainers, demanded that the officers surrender their charges. Knott County's Clabe Jones acted as a one-man appellate court and freed many malefactors whose crimes were no greater than his own. He stirred up no little trouble by entering into the bailiwicks of other warlords and rescuing men whose sad plight touched his tender heart. During the feuds, such a friend was infinitely more valuable to a defendant than any number of skilled lawyers. In at least one county, officials resorted to a unique device in an effort to preserve the life of a trial judge. Sheets of steel were bolted together around the judicial bench to form a protective box or canopy. By this means, it was sought to lessen the danger of having the judge shot by an irate spectator or perhaps with a high-powered rifle from a wooded hillside. Mountain judges during these years risked their lives daily, and some died in an effort to bring respect for law to a grim and savage people. So diabolical did the feuds become, and so long did they persist, that they sparked a considerable exodus from the region. Thoughtful men who had no interest in the wars which so engrossed the energies of their kinsmen began moving west. The disorders in Kansas, Texas, and New Mexico were as teapot tempests compared to those raging in their own mountains. Today, countless mountaineers have distant relatives residing half a continent westward. A terrible quality of these monstrous adventures in homicide was that they were virtually self-perpetuating, without distractions from the larger outside world to attract the Highlanders' attention and hold their interests. Each personal affront or injury was remembered and recounted. The ties of blood kinship were exceedingly important, and an injury, real or imagined, even to a third or fourth cousin, was likely to instill indignant umbrage. Their thoughts tended to dwell on the accumulating grievances of the decades, and frequently hatreds came to center on an entire family because of some act of one of its long-dead ancestors. Sometimes such hatreds persisted even after the name of the original offender was only dimly remembered, and the offensive act itself was forgotten. Thus the mountaineer came to inherit the hatreds of his father along with his name. Corn liquor, copiously consumed to induce relief from boredom, often fired vengeful excursions against the foe. The mountaineer's hatreds became so many layered, so deeply ingrained, and so tenaciously remembered that they were subconscious. And As such, they have, to a remarkable degree, been transmitted to present-day descendants. This accounts largely for the remarkable personal turn which politics always takes in the Highlands, even now, a fact that which will be discussed at length in later chapters. Even today, a mountain office seeker is likely to find it impossible to win by taking a stand on public issues. His electorate is far more likely to vote for or against him because of something his uncle or grandfather did, perhaps before the candidate's birth, than because he proposes to improve schools or construct new roads. And that closes out chapter 4 of Night Comes to the Cumberlands. So it's very fascinating. Henry Caudill plays up to the belief that the heritage Appalachian, can be a very vengeful, uncouth, and extremely violent people. And I've mentioned this before. Madison Grant, in his book, do I have it here? Yes. Madison Grant mentions in his book, Conquest of a Continent, that the Ulster Scots and the Border English who settled Appalachia were addicted to violence and killings because of their time in the Old World, the border wars between the Scottish, the Lowland Scots, and the English that went on for centuries. But anyways, I just wanted to make this video because I thought it was worth sharing, worth reading, worth talking about. Because as I see it, is for our people's survival in the generations to come, we're going to have to adopt some of these traits, whether we like it or not, because we have so many things against us. And I would rather be proactive than reactive. Thank y'all for watching. Bye-bye.